I used to be a pastor, not just in title, but in my whole being. I lived, breathed, and preached the Word of God. I served at the Vatican, the very heart of the Catholic Church, and I truly believed I was fulfilling my divine purpose. For years, I stood before congregations and told the story of creation as it's written in the Bible, that God formed Adam from the dust, created Eve from his rib, placed them in the Garden of Eden, and gave them a single rule they ultimately broke. I believed it wholeheartedly. There wasn't a shred of doubt in me. That story was the foundation of everything I taught and everything I thought I knew about life, humanity, and God. But slowly, something began to shift. It wasn't rebellion, it wasn't anger, it was curiosity, quiet at first, like a whisper in the back of my mind. I started asking questions not to disprove my faith, but to understand it more deeply. That led me to explore ancient writings, texts that predate the Bible by thousands of years. I dug into Sumerian history, one of the earliest known civilizations, and what I found changed everything. The Sumerians told their own creation story, and to my surprise, it wasn't all that different. They spoke of the Anunnaki beings who came from the sky. These weren't gods in the way we think of God. They were rulers, creators, and shapers of early human life. According to their texts, humans were not created out of love or divine inspiration. They were created to serve a purpose, to work, to build, to mine. The Anunnaki, it said, used a mix of their own essence and the clay of the earth to form mankind. At first, I resisted what I was reading. It challenged everything I believed, but the more I studied, the more the connections revealed themselves. Both stories involved humans created by a higher power. Both included themes of obedience, purpose, and consequences tied to knowledge. It didn't feel like coincidence anymore. It felt like a retelling, one version wrapped in religion, the other in myth. That realization shook me. It also freed me. Because I didn't lose my faith, I found a new way to understand it, one rooted not in fear of asking questions, but in the courage to seek truth. And that's where my real journey began, not in the pulpit, but in the unknown, where faith and curiosity finally met. When I first started speaking out about what I had discovered, I knew it was going to make people uncomfortable. But I didn't expect how quickly everything would fall apart. I wasn't trying to be controversial, I wasn't looking to create division. I was simply sharing the connections I had found, the similarities between the story of Adam and Eve in the Bible and the much older Sumerian myths involving the Anunnaki. I spoke about the possibility that the creation story many of us were raised on might actually be a retelling of something far more ancient. I thought people would at least be open to asking questions. I was wrong. The backlash came fast and hard. Colleagues I'd worked with for years stopped returning my calls. Friends distanced themselves. Some even warned others to stay away from me. I was asked to resign from my position, removed from the pulpit, and quietly shut out of the faith community I had served for most of my life. Just like that, I went from being a respected pastor to someone people saw as a threat. It hurt more than I can fully explain. I had given everything to the church, but in the silence that followed, something else came into focus. I had touched a nerve. Not because I was wrong, but because I was getting too close to something people weren't ready to face. That's when I realized some truths don't stay hidden because they're untrue. They stay hidden because they're inconvenient. Because they disrupt the narratives that hold certain systems, religious, political, cultural, in place. The deeper I went, the more I began to see how often history has been edited, shaped, even rewritten to protect power. What gets passed down isn't always the truth, it's what keeps people obedient. And when you start asking questions that challenge that structure, you're not just seen as curious, you're seen as dangerous. But I've come to believe that some of us are wired to question. Some of us are born with a restlessness, a deep knowing that there's more to the story than we've been told. If you're reading this, maybe you feel it too. Maybe that quiet pull inside you, the one urging you to dig deeper, isn't something to ignore. Maybe it's the beginning of your own journey. Because once the truth calls you, you can't unhear it, and once you see it, you can't go back. After everything, I lost my position, my pulpit, the community I once called home. I could have chosen to walk away from it all. Honestly, that would have been the easier road. I had every reason to stay quiet, to retreat back into a life of comfort where I didn't have to challenge anything or anyone. But deep down, I knew I couldn't do that. I had uncovered something real, something that couldn't be unseen. and I felt a responsibility to share it. Not from a place of pride or rebellion, but from a place of purpose. That's when I realized my calling hadn't ended, it had only shifted. I no longer stood inside a church speaking to a congregation. Now, my ministry lives here through a camera on a screen, reaching people I may never meet face to face. This YouTube channel became my new pulpit. Not one built on dogma or tradition, but on truth-seeking, open-mindedness, and the courage to explore the unknown. I didn't start this to tear anything down. I started it to dig deeper, to ask the questions no one dared to ask in Sunday school, to create a space for people who have always felt that quiet nudge in their soul, the feeling that something about our origin stories doesn't quite add up. People like you, people who are willing to listen, learn, and think for themselves. I'm not here to tell you what to believe. I'm here to explore alongside you. To connect ancient texts, hidden histories, and suppressed truths. To revisit the stories we thought we knew and look at them with fresh eyes. Because when you do that, when you follow the trail of curiosity, it leads somewhere powerful. And here's what I've learned. We're not just building a channel. We're building a movement, a community, a ministry of seekers, people who aren't afraid to question, to grow, to evolve. People who want something more than comfort, they want meaning. They want truth, no matter how uncomfortable it may be. So if you've made it here, I believe it's not by chance. Something in you is ready to search, to challenge, and maybe even to heal. This isn't the end of my journey. It's just a new chapter, and maybe, just maybe, it's the beginning of yours too. For most of my life, I believe the biblical creation story was the original blueprint of humanity's beginning. Adam formed from dust, Eve from his rib, a garden called Eden, a divine command, and a moment of disobedience that changed everything. It wasn't just a story, it was the foundation of my faith, the story I preached, and the truth I never thought to question. I saw it as sacred, unquestionable, and complete. But that changed when I started diving into older sources, ancient Sumerian texts that predate the Bible by thousands of years. I wasn't expecting to find anything that would shake me, but the more I read, the more unsettled I became. The Sumerians told their own story of creation. And though it came from a different time and culture, it sounded familiar. They spoke of the Anunnaki beings who came from the skies and created humans, but not out of love or spiritual purpose. According to these ancient writings, humans were created as workers. The gods didn't want to mine or farm themselves, so they made us to do it. At first, the stories seemed worlds apart. The God of Genesis is loving, commanding, and moral. The Anunnaki were described more as powerful rulers than divine caretakers. But when I looked closer, the similarities became impossible to ignore. In both accounts, humans are shaped from the earth, either from dust or clay, and brought to life with something from their creators, whether it's God's breath or the essence of the Anunnaki. In both, there's a structure, a role to fulfill, an expectation to obey. And in both, knowledge plays a pivotal role. In Genesis, Adam and Eve are warned not to eat from the tree of knowledge. In the Sumerian myths, humans are given knowledge, but eventually grow too independent and rebellious. It made me wonder, could the story I had always seen as the beginning actually be a retelling of something older? Could the Genesis account be a more spiritualized, simplified version of a much older narrative? That realization didn't destroy my faith, it deepened it. It reminded me that truth doesn't have to start with one version. Sometimes it echoes across cultures, told in different languages, through different lenses. And maybe, just maybe, when we stop arguing about which version is right and start asking why they're so similar, we'll get closer to the truth we've been seeking all along. One theme that echoes through both the Bible and the Sumerian texts is this: knowledge is powerful, but it comes at a cost. That idea has stayed with me ever since I began comparing the story of Adam and Eve with the myths of the Anunnaki. In both traditions, knowledge isn't just a blessing, it's a turning point, a spark that changes everything. And in both, it brings consequences that can't be undone. In the Bible, Adam and Eve start in a state of complete innocence. They're given a beautiful paradise, everything they could ever need, and just one rule: don't eat from the tree of knowledge. But when the serpent tempts them, when Eve eats the fruit and shares it with Adam, something shifts. Their eyes open. They see themselves differently. They become aware, and with that awareness comes shame, fear, and punishment. They're cast out of Eden. Innocence is gone. Life becomes struggle. That's the cost of knowledge. The Sumerian version tells a similar story, though it plays out differently. The Anunnaki give humans knowledge, skills like farming, building, writing, and more. These gifts help civilization grow fast, maybe too fast. Eventually, humans become noisy, rebellious, and harder to control. The gods, especially Enlil, grow frustrated. Instead of guiding humanity further, they decide to wipe the slate clean with a massive flood. Again, we see the same message. Knowledge brings advancement, but it also brings danger. Progress leads to punishment. What strikes me is that in both stories, knowledge is seen not just as information but as power. And those in control fear what happens when we, as humans, become aware of that power. Billy Carson talks about this too. He suggests that these myths might not be just metaphors, but reflections of real events, times in early human history when we were given knowledge by more advanced beings and weren't quite ready for the responsibility that came with it. To me, the message isn't about obedience. It's about control. These stories are less about keeping us in line and more about keeping us small. But here's the truth. Knowledge isn't the enemy. Fear is. Fear of what we might become. Fear of what we might discover if we keep digging. And maybe the real test isn't whether we're willing to seek knowledge, it's whether we're brave enough to carry what it shows us. One of the most unexpected and powerful connections I found between the Bible and ancient Sumerian texts was the story of the Great Flood. Like many people, I grew up hearing the story of Noah, how God saw the wickedness of mankind, how he chose Noah to build an ark, and how the flood wiped out a corrupt world. It always felt like a one-of-a-kind story, a lesson about morality, obedience, and divine justice. But when I began reading the Epic of Gilgamesh, I realized that nearly the exact same story had already been told thousands of years earlier, just with different names and different reasons. In the Sumerian version, there's a man named Utnapishtim. He's warned by a god that a massive flood is coming. He's told to build a giant boat, save his family, and preserve animals. Sound familiar? After the waters recede, he releases birds to find dry land and offers a sacrifice in gratitude. The details are incredibly close to the story of Noah, but the motivation behind the flood is completely different. In the Bible, God sends the flood because humanity had become violent and corrupt. It's a moral reset, a divine judgment meant to cleanse the earth and start again. But in the Sumerian story, the flood isn't about sin, it's about control. The gods, especially Enlil, are simply tired of humans being too noisy and disruptive. They decide to destroy humanity, not because of evil, but because they want peace and quiet. It's not about morality, it's about convenience. That difference really made me stop and think. Two nearly identical stories, separated by centuries and cultures, but with entirely different messages. One frames the flood as a righteous act, the other as a reaction of annoyance. And yet in both, we see a higher power choosing a single man to survive. We see humanity given a second chance. And we see the idea that destruction can also be a new beginning. Zecharia Sitchin offered an even bolder theory that the flood was not myth, but history. He suggested that the Anunnaki may have used a global catastrophe to reset humanity, like wiping the board clean and starting over. Whether you believe that or not, the similarities between these ancient flood stories raise an important question: are we remembering history or rewriting it? Either way, the flood reminds us that power doesn't always act out of justice. Sometimes it acts out of fear, and it's up to us to ask why. When I first came across the theories of Billy Carson and Zecharia Sitchin, I'll admit I was skeptical. Their ideas didn't fit into anything I had ever learned or taught. They challenged the traditional stories I had built my life around. But at the same time, I couldn't ignore how some of what they said connected with the ancient texts I was reading for myself. The more I listened, the more I realized they weren't just inventing wild theories, they were asking questions no one else was willing to ask. Billy Carson suggests that many of the myths we grew up thinking were symbolic might actually be rooted in real events. He believes the story of the Anunnaki isn't just mythology, it could be history, told in the language of the ancient world. According to Carson, these beings came to Earth with advanced knowledge and shared it with early humans. That's why, seemingly out of nowhere, civilizations like Sumer emerged with agriculture, writing, astronomy, and architecture skills that normally take much longer to develop. Then there's Zecharia Sitchin, whose work shook me to my core. After years of studying Sumerian tablets, Sitchin proposed that the Anunnaki weren't gods at all, but advanced extraterrestrials from a planet called Nibiru. According to him, they came to Earth looking for gold to repair their atmosphere. And to help mine it, they genetically engineer humans, mixing their DNA with the creatures already here. Sound crazy? It did to me too. But when I compared that theory with Sumerian texts describing gods mixing their essence with clay to create man, I couldn't dismiss it so easily. Sitchin also reinterpreted many of the so-called miracles in ancient stories as misunderstood technology. Flying gods? Maybe spacecraft? The heavens? Not the sky, but space? What if our ancestors described the extraordinary with the only language they had? Now, I'm not saying I agree with everything Carson or Sitchin have written, but I will say this. Their work cracked something open in me. They reminded me that truth isn't always found in what's popular. It's often buried where few are willing to look. They gave me the courage to challenge what I thought I knew, to connect the dots between myth, science, and spirit. And maybe, just maybe, they're helping us remember something we've long forgotten, that our story is far bigger, older, and more mysterious than we were ever taught. Looking back at this entire journey from the story of Adam and Eve to the ancient Sumerian myths, the flood narratives, and the bold theories from researchers like Billy Carson and Zecharia Sitchin, I've come to realize something important. These stories, no matter how old or how strange they may seem, are all pointing us toward the same truth. They may use different names, different symbols, and different gods, but they're asking the same human questions. Where did we come from? Why are we here? And what are we really capable of? What's most fascinating is how similar these ancient stories are, even though they came from civilizations separated by time and distance. In each, humanity is created by higher beings. In each, knowledge is given but not without consequence. And in each, we see power trying to control that knowledge. These aren't just religious stories. They're reflections of a deeper struggle, one we still face today. A struggle between control and freedom, between fear and awakening. We live in a time where information is more accessible than ever, yet truth feels harder to find. We're told to trust the system, follow the rules, and not dig too deep. But just like in the stories of Adam and Eve, or the humans who defied the Anunnaki, the moment we start asking uncomfortable questions, we're seen as dangerous. That pattern hasn't changed. The names have, the structures have, but the fear of human potential, that's still here. And that's the lesson I carry with me now. Truth doesn't fear questions, only lies do. If something is real, it can stand the weight of scrutiny. And if something falls apart when you examine it, maybe it wasn't truth to begin with. So here's what I want to leave you with. If you've ever felt that quiet tug in your soul, that sense that something about our history doesn't quite add up, you're not crazy, and you're not alone. You're part of a much larger awakening, one that's happening all over the world in quiet corners and open conversations. Maybe Eden was never lost. Maybe it was hidden inside us, waiting for us to reclaim it through awareness, through courage, and through the willingness to seek what others fear to find. The journey doesn't end here. In many ways, it's just beginning, and if you're still reading, then maybe, just maybe, you are ready to walk that path too.